The assumption is that empowerment is a declaration, that announcing it creates it magically. It's not the way it really works. It is an environment. It's not a statement. The conditions have to be built before the word can hold any weight at all. Without outcome clarity, boundary conditions, and decision rights, I'd argue that empowered means unsupervised with anxiety. Well, hey there, senior leader, and welcome to the Talent Sherpa podcast. This is where senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. I'm your host, Jackson Lynch, and today I am joined by my co-host, Scott Morris. He's a former CHRO with the scar tissue to prove it, the possible inventor of a leadership philosophy he cannot fully explain at a dinner party, and the founder of Propulsion AI. Now, Scott, here's what I keep running into. Leaders say the word empowerment like it is this gift. It's manna from heaven. It's like saying it out loud is the work. But you and I have both been in rooms where the manager announced that the team was empowered, and then 3 weeks later, they walked in and rewrote the entire damn deliverable. And nobody said anything because nobody was surprised. I've done that, I gotta be honest, and I suspect you have too.
Not only have I been the manager who has done that, but I have worked for the manager who has done it. It's a cycle. Hey, I'm excited to pull this one apart with you. But before we dive into this, Jackson, do us a favor, everyone. Please subscribe to the podcast right now, or leave us a comment, or drop us a quick review on your preferred platform. Those methods are how we grow the pod and how we keep the content sharp for other senior leaders.
Yeah, that's super helpful. So here is what I think is actually happening out there. Empowerment has become one of those words that lives on every engagement survey, every leadership development curricula, every town hall deck. And yet Gallup tells us that only about 23% of employees globally feel engaged at work. And that number has barely moved in a decade. And if it has moved, it's gone down. So something is not connecting.
And you know what I think is not connecting is that most managers treat the concept of empowerment like a posture, not a contract. They say it, and I think a lot of them mean it. They genuinely want their people to own the work, but they skip the part where they actually define what ownership means. They skip the hard work that they have to do. And I think there's a second thing underneath that. Most managers have never had to name their own constraints before. They know what they will and won't tolerate, but they've never been asked to write it down before handing off the work. So the team inherits a set of invisible rules, or what I think we can only think of as invisible rules, that become visible when somebody breaks one, and that's a bad timing.
Exactly. And that gap, which is the gap between intending to empower someone and actually setting them up to be empowered, that's where trust quietly dies. And let me give you a real example from my own work. A few years ago, I was a CHRO, mid-sized company in Atlanta. We had a very serious problem with onboarding. New hires were hitting their 90-day mark feeling overwhelmed, unprepared, and honestly a little misled about the job that they had taken. The turnover in the first year was running hot in a really important function. And I had a direct report. We're going to call her Mara. She was sharp, motivated, and ready to lead something. So before I handed it off to her, though, I sat her down and named 3 outcomes. I want us to get new hires productive faster. I want us to create a genuine, I'm glad I joined feeling at the 90-day mark. And I want to stay clean on the compliance side. And then I told her the walls on the sandbox. Like, there's no spending over $5,000 without talking to me. No asking another function to change their process without looping me in first. No commitments that we can't walk back. No irrevocable bets. Everything else, it's hers. Go build it. So she built the team. She ran agile sprints. She delivered a working prototype in about 3 weeks. Let me say that again, 3 weeks. I did not attend a single working session. I got a status update at week 2. I signed off on her final version. And then I watched her present it to the leadership team with zero anxiety. And if you know her, that's quite something. She owned every decision in that room.
And you know what? That version, Jackson, that version is what most managers never see because they never do the prep work that you just described. And there are elements in what you just said that we're going to pull apart one by one in the episode. But let me paint the contrast for the audience. And this is not my personal example, but it is absolutely one that I watched, right? So let's say we have a manager and her direct report, Dana. Dana was handed a similar challenge in a different company: rebuild a core process. 12 weeks worth of work, and she was fully empowered, as the manager liked to say. So, week 3, that manager walks in and starts redirecting things. Week 5, that manager is joining the working sessions. Week 8, the manager has flagged that the framing was off a little bit and asked the team to go back to the drawing board. Week 10, Dana brought in a revised version to talk about with the manager, and the manager said it was close, but it needed more work. Week 12, the team submitted what they had finally developed, and the manager shelved everything and said the timing wasn't right. Now, that's a bad story, but here's the worst punchline. And that is that 4 months later, Dana leaves the company. Here's the part that makes that story worse. The manager in that story genuinely believed that she was being helpful every single time that she stepped in. Each intervention, I think, to her, felt like she was saving the team. What she never saw was the accumulated weight of 12 weeks of corrections with no framework, no boundary, no decision rights. And she turned a capable person, Dana, into somebody who stopped trusting their own judgment. And the project never shipped. That manager was the root cause, but Dana became the reason.
Yeah, I love that, because I talk about assuming positive intent a lot. And as I listen to your story, I'm like, that manager doesn't know what they're doing, but it's really, really important. They thought they were acting in the best interest of the team. It wasn't malicious. So I really appreciate the way you phrase that. And then here's the implication of it. The word empowerment becomes a lie, not an intentional lie, but functionally it's a lie, because the team heard a promise. Then they watched the manager break it in slow motion. So that's actually what we're going to dig into a little bit today. Not the intention behind empowerment, which is, I'd say it's usually genuine, but the 3 conditions that made Mara's story work and what happens to the team when you skip them. So let's dive in. We'll call out a few of the faulty assumptions that get leaders stuck. Okay, the first one is, and we've all heard this, I empowered them. The manager said the word, so the contract's complete. This is how it actually functions, even though no one would agree with it if you said it out loud as plainly as I just did. The assumption is that empowerment is a declaration, that announcing it creates it magically. It's not the way it really works. Empowerment is an environment. It's not a statement. The conditions have to be built before the word can hold any weight at all. So without outcome clarity, boundary conditions, and decision rights, I'd argue that empowered means unsupervised with anxiety.
Yeah, I think that's right. Here's another one. They know what good looks like. These are smart people. I don't need to tell them what good looks like. The assumption here is that capability and clarity are the same thing, and that a talented person is somehow just going to intuit what the destination is that's in that manager's mind. But the reality is, Jackson, that smart people make fast decisions in ambiguous environments, and some of those decisions may be exactly wrong. And when the manager then comes in and overrides them, the smart person doesn't learn what good looks like. They learn that the manager can't be trusted to stay out of the work.
Well, which leads me to the assumption I'm staying close because I care about the outcome, or for whatever. Like, the manager frames their intervention as an investment rather than control. And, stealing from you earlier, they probably genuinely believe this. It doesn't feel that way. And the assumption is that presence equals support, and that showing up in the working session is helping to coach real time rather than surveillance, right? But here's the reality. I think when you attend every meeting, your presence actually changes the meeting. The team is no longer solving the problem. They are managing you inside the meeting. Your proximity consumes the oxygen that autonomy needs to grow, and that's part of the empowerment process.
Nobody wants to micromanage, but that's exactly what happens when that work doesn't get done up front. And I think a lot of managers will go to this 4th one, and again, with the best of intentions, right? And here's the assumption: they should have come to me if they needed something. Because why? Because I have an open door policy, or because I told them that they could come to me. The assumption is somehow that the open door is a substitute for the defined decision framework. Availability is the same thing as clarity, and it's just not. The reality is that open door policies, and we should all have them, right? We want the teams to come to us, but open doors don't help if the team doesn't understand which decisions require them to walk through that open door and go and check. And without decision rights, without clarity about who is going to get to decide what, everything feels like there's a potential for an override. And so people are either going to stop, or they're going to over escalate, or they're going to stop without escalating entirely. And none of those are really good. And both outcomes bury the manager and confuse the team, and they paralyze.
But they said the word.
You're empowered. Here's the one I keep coming back to, Jackson. It's number 2 from our list. People know what good looks like because they're smart people. We hire for capability, and then we withhold, again, not intentionally, but we still withhold the context that makes the capability that we hired for useful. And when the person fails to read our minds, then we call it a development gap. And what makes this one particularly, I think, insidious is that it feels like a compliment. You're smart. You're going to figure it out. I'm not worried about it. But what we're really saying is, I don't want to do the work. I don't want to do the work of describing what it is that's in my head that controls the difference between a good outcome and not a good outcome, which means that the capable person spends a lot of their energy reverse engineering what I'm thinking in my head, what my mental model is, instead of actually solving the problem. Or they spend a lot of time getting disappointed over and over and over again when they don't get to whatever is in my head that I never told them to begin with.
Yeah. I think we've seen that. I've seen that more times than I know. And where I see it most actually is in managers who are the strongest at their work, the ones who are genuinely an expert. Because, and I think I've fallen into this too, the more clear a picture you have of what good looks like in your head, the harder it is to describe it in a way that somebody else can use. So in this really, really perverse way, your knowledge, your expertise is in fact the obstacle. So like pulling it back out a little bit more, the truth underneath of all of this, I think, is that empowerment is not something that you give. It is something that you build. Those are different verbs. And most of us were never taught kind of why you would pick one verb versus the verse.
Before you say the word, you have to do the work. And that work is hard. You got to think through what good looks like. You got to think through what your conditions are that you don't want people to stray outside of. Those conditions, those are what we're about to walk through. Those are the materials. And this isn't theory. These are specific things that made, in your case, Mara's story land in 3 weeks. And in my case, made Dana's story cost somebody their job. So how do we move from empowerment as a declaration to empowerment as a design? And Jackson, I keep coming back to this when we were talking through the episode, when you and I were getting ready. There are 3 conditions that have to exist before the word empowerment means anything at all. We're calling this, between us, we call it the empowerment contract. And until all 3 of those are in place, the manager hasn't actually done their full job.
Right. And we should trademark the empowerment contract, because I think it's really important.
A lot of things we should trademark.
And by the way, it's not that complicated. It's, however, the work that most managers skip because, I don't know, it feels like bureaucracy, and saying the word feels like trust, but they're not the same thing. So hit us with condition 1.
I don't think it feels like bureaucracy. I think it's just really hard mental work, and the urgent crowds out the important. But if you want to multiply the effort of the team, this is what we have to do. So, first of the conditions, outcome clarity. What does good look like? Most of the time, what managers give their teams is a destination without a definition of what an arrival looks like, right? Redesign the onboarding program, or like maybe said the way they would say it, I want you to redesign the onboarding program. It's a destination, right? But How are we going to know how well that worked? What does good look like at 30 days for that program? What does it look like at 90? What does it look like at a year? Now, in the case that you just described, you named the outcomes before the work started. Speed to productivity, if I remember this correctly, a genuine, I'm glad I joined feeling, paperwork compliance, right? 3 measurable outcomes. You were defining what good looked like. And that's more specific than a lot of teams ever get. And it's one of the reasons I suspect that Mara was able to deliver that project in 3 weeks without a lot of oversight from you. She wasn't guessing what done looked like. She knew because you had described what good looked like in the outcome. And that gave her clarity, and I think this is important, and it gave her permission to decide on methodology without having to check in with you. The destination was fixed, but the route was hers.
And here's what I think that clarity actually unlocks. When the outcome is defined and agreed on, every methodology question the team faces becomes answerable, ta-da, without the manager. Should we sequence compliance first or speed first? Well, which gets us to the 3 outcomes faster, right? The team can then reason their way through to the right answer without having to get anyone else involved. Without that clarity, the team's not working without direction, but they are working without any sort of decision framework. And every choice then has to come back to the manager because there is no other way to check it.
Which is exactly why Dana's manager kept getting pulled in, so to speak, because there weren't any named outcomes. And every time the manager reviewed the work, they were measuring it against that picture that they had in their head, a picture that Dana had never seen, or at least I don't think she had seen it. The corrections that the manager was giving felt arbitrary because they were arbitrary in the only way that mattered, which is that Dana didn't have a way to anticipate them.
And Scott, I think that brings us to number 2, and that's boundary conditions. Those are the honest answer to the question, kind of, where are the walls in the sandbox? Not preferences, that's different. Not suggestions, like literally, where are the walls? So with Mara, I named them before she started. No spending over $5,000 without a conversation. No asking another function to change their process without looping me in. No commitments that were not able to walk back easily. Those are the 3 things that required me. Everything else was hers to decide. Now compare that to Dana's situation. 12 weeks, no name boundaries. The manager had walls. They were a real one, but he never shared them. They were never described. So every time Dana hit one, it felt like a surprise to her and a correction coming from the manager. By week 8, Dana stopped making decisions. She was guessing at invisible lines, hoping not to cross them. And I guess the way I think about boundary conditions is this. You got to name the 3 things, the non-negotiables that exist regardless of outcome compliance requirements or budget caps or dependencies that affect other functions. You've got to name the things that require a conversation before the team proceeds. Like for me, it's spending decisions, anything that asks a peer to change their behavior, because that comes in from the side. I don't want to be surprised. Commitments that are hard to walk back, to me, like irrevocable bets, because I want actually people to stumble a little bit. It's weird, but I let people fail intentionally because that is the best way to grow. And you learn something and that learning sticks. And I don't know, it might be why I have, over my career developed so many, sitting CHROs, because they had the ability to try something that made sense to them and they failed. And then they were like, okay, I'm not going to do that again. Me telling them not to do it is probably not nearly as impactful. So what it means though, is you got to give them the ability to manage through their own complexity without checking in. And if you can't articulate those walls, honestly, you're not ready to start the work.
I want to give you a friendly correction, but only because I know you, and I know you well enough to know that you don't let people fail. But what you do is you say, exactly as you did in the Morrow story, here's a sandbox. Now, the creative space that's inside of that, that's yours. When people come back and they haven't been creative enough, I've watched you push them back in and say, no, go be more creative. But The operative piece of that is you're not stepping over them to give them an answer, and you're not correcting what they've done. You're just saying, I don't think this is your best work. Go back in and fix that. That's where the growth happens. The failure is when you don't describe the walls, they stray outside them, and you go, oh no, we can't possibly do that. That's a failure. You don't do that. You're very deliberate about this. And I think one thing that I've watched you be really good at is naming the when do you need to come to me, right? Because I think a lot of managers are tempted to keep things vague. Use your judgment, check with me if it feels big. That is not a framework. That is anxiety with a really nice tone. And the team needs to know before the project starts the specific kind of decisions that they get to make on their own, even if you may not agree with every single aspect of it. They also need to know the ones that you are emphatic about that need a conversation. And when a manager does this, they need to frame them, I think, without flinching, because the moment you leave a category vague, and you and I talk about clarity all the time on this pod, you create that Dana situation just with really good intentions that, we understand that you have.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also worth saying that the boundary conditions don't have to be comprehensive, right? They just have to be honest. Like 3, 4, 5 real constraints clearly named are worth way more than a 10-page delegation framework brought to you by the big box consultants that no one will ever read or remember. The goal isn't to cover every scenario. Like that's hard. That's impossible. The goal is to give the team the principled basis really for deciding which scenarios require you. Scott, why don't you take number 3?
Decision rights. Because we're talking about it, I think decision rights is one of the most important questions a team member is going to have, especially if they are people who want to take initiative and who want to explore and who want to be creative. They want to know, what is it that I can decide on my own, not in theory, but in practice for this project this week. So what you described as the framework is genuinely useful, I think. You've got to check, if I'm remembering your details, you got to check with me on anything that is irreversible commitment, right? If you're going to do that, let's have a conversation about it. I'm not going to tell you how to decide, maybe. I'm not going to give you the answer, maybe, but you got to come in, we got to have a conversation about it. It's honest, and honesty beats comprehensive every time. A team member can actually hold it in their head. They can use it when they're staring at a boundary condition at 9:00 on a Tuesday morning.
Yeah. And what I noticed with Mara is that the decision rights framework freed her up from a very specific kind of exhaustion. And that's the exhaustion of constantly wondering, is this one of the decisions I need to loop Jackson in on? And when that question has a very clear answer, the energy that used to be going towards managing that uncertainty, or managing the manager, or me in this case, it goes directly into the work, which allows her to be faster. Not because she had extra capacity, but because she didn't have that extra weight of second guessing every call.
There's a signal value here that I think gets missed too, Jackson. And when you give somebody a decision rights framework before the work starts, you're communicating something about who they are in the project. You're saying, I've thought through where your authority begins and where mine as the manager ends. I've done the work on my end. I'm asking you to own this, not to perform ownership. That changes how the people show up. You want people that take initiative. You have to be clear about the outcome, the boundary conditions, and the decision rights. Dana never got that signal. What she had was a very enthusiastic manager, and at the start, and a slow erosion of confidence every time that manager had invisible lines that got crossed.
And here's what changes when all 3 of those conditions are in place. The team stops managing the manager. They start managing the work, which is exactly what happened with Mara, because she knew from day one, here are the outcomes. This is your sandbox. These are the 3 types of decisions that need me, and everything else is yours. And I do appreciate you saying I didn't let her fail, or I don't let people fail, but I kind of do. Like, there are times where you look into it and you say, somewhat like, I would not make that decision based upon my experience, but they have not made that experience yet. And it's not going to be like super damaging, So I will point and say, have you considered the implication of this? And if they say yes, then I will let them go do that, because then they will realize they didn't really consider the implication of this. And next time they'll say, oh, is that what you were trying to get me to do? And I'm like, yeah. So that failure point, I think, is really important, because it allows her not to bring anxiety. Instead, she's like, we had a finished product in 3 weeks and stood up in front of the management team, didn't even need me to validate a single slide. That ultimately is what the prep work buys you. It's defined in speed.
But you know what? Here, so I'm going to push you again on this, because I think there's a nugget in this. You're not really letting them fail. What you did was you crafted the boundary conditions, because outside of those was failure. What you're saying is, I wouldn't have made that decision, and you did, and you stayed within the lines, even though I don't agree with the decision. And that's important. And if it ultimately is something that they have to walk back, that is where the learning happens. And I think you're right on that. I just don't call it a failure. I think that is the failure would have been if you didn't define the boundary conditions. But maybe semantics. I don't know. The real thing,
arguing about words.
We're in violent agreement. The key point here is you did the hard work up front, and that is what ultimately leads to greater success. So I think the real question here is, are you willing to do the prep work as a manager before you use a word like empowerment? Because most managers skip it, and it's not because they're lazy, but because it forces doing that prep work, thinking about the outcome, thinking about the boundaries, thinking about the decision rights conversation. That's hard work, and it forces a conversation that a lot of us would just find it easier to avoid, which is, where does my authority end? Where does that person's authority begin? It's a vulnerable conversation, and it requires a manager to name their own limits. And naming limits feels like losing control, when it's actually the only thing, I think, that creates it.
Well, that's true. And if you, like, at some point, you can't scale if you're in the middle of everything. And so it is a force multiplier as you go forward. So let's maybe transition now to talk about what a CHRO can do to start this week. And first one you'll love, because it's an audit. That's my idea. You should always audit things. Pick a project when you think you had empowerment over the last 30 days. Write down the 3 outcomes, the boundary conditions, and the decision rights as you understand them. You can either be the manager or the team. Probably easier if you're the manager. Then ask the team to do the same exercise independently, and then compare the two. The gaps between them are exactly what you owe the team before the next sprint begins.
And, we're talking about this in a project-based sense, but I think this works also for how you treat people when they're in their actual role. The next thing I would do, easy thing for CHROs to start, run the boundary conditions before you kick off the next project. Don't add it to the agenda. Schedule a separate 45-minute session where the explicit agenda item is, here's where I'm going to keep my hands in my pockets, and here's where I'm going to take them out and help you, right? Here's where I'm going to walk in, and here's where it's yours. Name the non-negotiables. Name the things that need a conversation. Name the things that are fully delegated. Put it in writing. Not as a bureaucratic artifact, but putting it in writing. There's something special about writing something down, right? It becomes a living reference document that the team can actually use.
Yeah, and if you walk into a piece of work and you change something, you should say out loud what you're doing and why, right? So I'm overriding your sequencing decision because of a dependency with finance that I should have named before we got started. That's on me, not you. Here's the constraint. Like that, when you do that, it's not making the override comfortable, but it keeps the trust account from getting overdrawn. And the team can tolerate a correction that they understand, especially if you take the blame for that, right? They can't tolerate a correction that feels arbitrary and something that is as a result of their work. That's how you lose the trust.
I know we're trying to do these things in sequence. I actually think, Jackson, you just named the really most important one, because it not only helps the team in the way you just described, but it helps you as the manager recognize where your thinking was incomplete. You can make a correction on that for the next time that you run the playbook. So here's a fourth one. Have a debrief that you've been skipping. If you've overridden a team in the last 90 days without a direct conversation about what it meant for their authority or their ability to act independently, schedule a conversation for this week. Not to relitigate it, but to repair the contract. Most managers, I think, skip that because it feels awkward, but leaving it unaddressed doesn't make the trust image go away. And that trust is what gets you greater work and better work and more independent work in the future. It pushes the next project to start from a deficit if you don't do it.
Yeah. I think that last one's the uncomfortable one for me. Going back and naming an override you already made and then owning the cost it had on someone's confidence, that's genuinely hard. Most leaders don't do it. But if you're sitting on a team that's gone quiet, that escalates everything. That checks in before making even the smallest move. Like there's a good chance you're already living in the aftermath of a Dana situation. So in that case, the conversation isn't really optional. It's the work that you need to do now. And with that, let me pivot into the best part of the entire show. Alrighty, senior leaders, here is your Talent Sherpa summary, or as Scott always says, empowerment is just an organizational redesign that hasn't admitted what it is yet.
I don't think I've ever said that, but here is the summary. 1, empowerment is not a declaration. It's a design. The word means nothing without the 3 conditions that make it real. 2, outcome clarity is the starting point. It's not the finish line. You also need boundary conditions. You also need decision rights, or the team is flying a plane without instruments. And having done that, it's not fun. Number 3, when you override a team that you said that you trusted, you're not only changing a deliverable, you are teaching them something. And what you're teaching them is that their authority was provisional and that you didn't really mean what you said about empowerment. Provisional authority is an authority. And 4th, the manager who skips the prep work, who doesn't do the hard stuff up front, doesn't end up with an empowered team. They end up with a bottleneck caused by their own actions. They own every decision that they were trying to delegate.
The takeaway for me is this. I spent years thinking empowerment was about trust, believing in people enough to let them run. And to be fair, it probably is. But trust isn't enough without the structure underneath. Trust without outcome clarity is hope. Trust without boundary conditions is a setup. Trust without decision rights is this nice thing that you said before you walked in and changed everything. So you got to do the work before you say the word. And if you already said it without doing the work, go back and do it now, because the team's still waiting and they're guessing what they've been empowered to do and what to actually decide on and what they actually own. That's it for today. I want to say thank you so much for tuning into the Talent Sherpa podcast. This is where, as you know, senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. Scott, this is so much fun to do with you. I'm just having the time of my life. I want to give a quick shout out to one of our favorite listeners. Hello, Christine in Atlanta. Thank you for being a part of the Talent Sherpa community. And we thank everyone for listening, whether it's in Santa Ana, California, or in Helsinki, Finland, where incidentally they have amazing gluten-free cinnamon rolls right there on the docks. It's really great. And it's so great to have you guys with us. Maybe we need to go have a live session in Helsinki so I can get more of those cinnamon rolls. Literally the best I've ever had in my life.
I like that idea. If you liked today's episode, do us a favor. Just take a second right now and hit the like button, or better yet, subscribe to the podcast. Leave us a review on your favorite platform, whether that's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or YouTube. We're ubiquitous on all of those. And it would really benefit the community if you take a moment and leave us a review. Those ways trigger the algorithm. The algorithm helps spread the content, and that's what helps senior leaders. It's free. It would be really helpful to us and potentially helpful to somebody else.
And if you're a CHRO wondering, where do I start my AI journey? Don't forget to check out the really cleverly named Propulsion AI at getpropulsion.ai. They're building a team of AI teammates to help human capital leaders work and focus on what matters to the business. Scott, can you tell us a little bit about what you help people with?
Well, not only what you just said, Jackson, but our AI teammates coach managers to create clarity and help them achieve better outcomes. They work directly with managers and alongside their human colleagues. And don't forget, if you're an early stage CHRO, Jackson's helped a lot of people exactly like you through personal coaching, through the very new CHRO Ascent Academy, and through his best-selling Substack. You can find all of those if you go to www.mytalentsherpa.com.
Thanks, Scott. And thank you to everyone who is listening. So until next time, keep raising the bar. do the work before you say the word and keep on climbing.